Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, and welcome to the Prose and Cons podcast by Precipice Fiction, because sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. Today, I'm joined by Alex Eldridge.
Yeah.
And Paddy Boylan.
Oh!
And I'm James Healy, and if you're wondering what's beside me, we recorded this shortly after Christmas, so it is the edge of my Christmas tree for those of you on YouTube. Today, the topic will be how what we're reading influences our writing. But first, I'd like to just jump in and ask, what have you guys been reading and watching over the Christmas period? Alex?
Yeah, I have been reading, this is going to be very pertinent to the topic, obviously, but I've actually been consuming a game from 2017 called Prey. It's got a long and storied
story,
well, that type of development history, but basically you're in a space station and there's spookies and, you know, you gotta figure your way out around that. So I've been playing that, and then I've also been reading a book on biochemistry and the origins of life.
Really?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Like popular science or like a textbook?
It's kind of halfway between, to be honest. It's pretty.
Wow.
It's engaging, but the material is challenging. So
I'm curious to know, Alex, how the book on biochemistry of life influences your writing. Very interesting. I kind of want to say now that to the audience listening, so the episodes we're recording are somewhat out of order. So if I say that, like,
we don't have to roll back, we're fine.
Well, maybe we can edit this out. But like, if I say like I'm
in media res, Paddy.
If I say I'm reading Moby Dick in one episode and then then I stop and then I start again, it's not because I picked it up again. Look, anyway, I've been reading the Hilary Mantel trilogy, the Wolf Hall trilogy, I'm going to call it, and I'm up to the last book, and by God, it's good. Just staggeringly good. This woman could, because she passed away sadly, just write like no one else. It's amazing. But before I start the last book, I'm reading, holding it up in the video, Mark Z. House of Leaves, which I'll get into it a little bit in this episode because it's really, I mean, Alex, you've read it, right? Like, there's nothing quite like it.
No, it's very, very singular.
Yeah, and it's really, I think, can influence some ideas I have forward. So yeah, House of Leaves, very cool. What about you, James?
I've been watching All of Us Are Dead. It's the Korean zombie series.
Heard of that.
Cool. It's very, very good. Very, very good. I finished that, and then I'm watching another Korean zombie series called Happiness. Apparently, the Koreans have a ton of zombie series that have come out over the last few years.
That's
actually
interesting.
Really good.
I wonder why.
I don't know. I think they did that train to Busan, and it was really successful.
I've not heard of that.
There seemed to be a lot of stuff coming out of Korea at the moment in the zombie genre, which is quite good.
I guess even in the States, like, things go through waves. Like the number of Mars movies and TV shows that came out at one point, you know?
Yeah. I guess, there's one thing that's successful and then everyone kind of copies it. But I feel like in Korea, it's almost the opposite. They're getting better and better. Like the installments seem to be improving each time, rather than one good one and then a bunch of like lame copycat things. So yeah, All of Us Are Dead. It's great if you're into zombie stories. I definitely advise watching it with the subtitles, because I originally watched it dubbed and it was terrible. I think it was probably because it was a really large cast, and I think they may not have had voice actors for every different person, because everyone didn't sound very the same.
So it's the same person with like a high voice and a low voice.
I think it was probably like 5 people playing 20 people.
Yeah. I guess costs mount when you start to hire like 1,000 actors, right?
Yeah.
Particularly
when you're thinking it's going to be like aired in every country. So yeah, that's really good. And I've also been reading Humankind, which is a kind of book which counters almost the presumption that people are selfish and kind of out for themselves, and that our humanity is a thin veneer. It's a story that goes into kind of how people react in crises and how we actually predominantly act not in the way that we'd expect. So both of those have been very useful since I've been writing some zombie-based apocalyptic stuff. And they've definitely influenced how I've approached certain scenes and certain things I've decided to add in.
Yeah, very interesting.
Hmm.
Do they talk about oh God, I maybe even cut this because I don't think I remember when. Yeah, Hurricane Katrina happened. I remember
Yes.
there were so many stories on like both sides of that philosophical fence. Like a lot of commentators saying, "Look what happens with all the looting and stuff when law and order collapses. People turn into monsters." But then there were just as many stories about the same event, saying, "Look at all these people helping each other, even though law and order has collapsed."
Yeah. So there was actually a tremendous amount of, well, according to the book, Humankind, there was a tremendous amount of misreporting by the news media about what was going on. I know that they were discussing looting and vandalism when it actually turned out, when the dust had settled, that people were getting supplies and medicine and bringing it to people who needed it. So it was actually the community helping one another. Unfortunately, what happened at Katrina was that they sent in like the National Guard or something, and a bunch of people got shot because of the perception that law and order had broken down and it had turned into chaos, when that didn't seem to be the case at all. There was reports of like violence and attacks and rapes that it seemed, when they tried to track down where these were, it seemed that they hadn't actually, that there was just an awful lot of the perception of chaos when it wasn't actually that much chaos. People were actually pretty good and people actually helped one another a lot.
That's very sad.
Yeah. So it goes into a number of situations like that, how people react when there's plane crashes, how people kind of pull together in wars, or when like civilian targets are bombed, which every nation seems to think will like cause the population to erupt into chaos. It seems that actually never happens. It actually seems that any time civilians are targeted, the fighting strength of the nation, everyone kind of pulls together a lot more. So there's a lot of things like that. So obviously, writing a zombie story, I'm talking about how people are selfish and they just erupt into this kind of violence against one another. So I'm thinking I might include a few counterpoints to that.
And then there's the core survivors that have to work together. So pretty cool that that's influencing your writing. That's very fortuitous considering the topic.
It's an interesting knife edge because we are drawn to news media that tells us that because it's perception, but we're also drawn to fiction that tells us that. So I'm in a position where I'm like, I'm writing something which is the point of people reading this is that they read about that tin veneer breaking down. And do I want to write something which, I don't know, I'm kind of in a weird place where I'm like, do I want to counter that, even if that's almost the thing I'm selling? Or do I want to expand that conversation or maybe represent humanity in a more accurate way?
I was going to say you could always represent both sides, James. You could have, that's like the stand. There we go. One. That's one. One side is like the survivors and the goodies who are trying to like do stuff, and then another is like a band of bandits or whatever who sort of one strongman comes to power through devious means or violence or destruction, and how those two.
Or I was thinking, because it's after the fact, some people have tales of when everything was coming down, what they saw around them was like looting and destruction and people turning on each other, and other people saying like, that's not my experience at all. Like, we saw people banding together, which is probably the truth, right? Like,
if you work together, your community has a better chance of surviving.
Yeah.
Whereas on an individual basis, if you're selfish, you have a better chance of surviving. So it kind of depends on the situation. That might be the angle I would take with it, because part of Bring 'em Bardo is certainly...
And Bring 'em Bardo is the thing you're writing at the moment.
One of the conflicts in that for the main character is which one of those ways is he going to lean?
That's actually a pretty intriguing thing to grapple with. I don't think I've seen as a theme in a book about everything coming down.
Yeah, cool, good. Because I think it'll be kind of about his perception being that things were pretty bad, but then people might be like, no, they weren't that bad. You're just viewing it that way. Paddy, how about you give me an example of a time something you were reading influenced how you were looking at a project you were working on, and how it influenced the way you were writing something?
Okay, so I don't have an example of how it's influencing my current writing, but I'm reading, once again, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski.
I think it's down.
I don't know if Alex, if you have... Yeah, that'll do. I think it's Polish. So this book is I mean, obviously, when you read something that's very different to other books or different to anything you've read before, I think it's always influence your writing. And this is making me think that I really want to try and incorporate some of the things that he's playing with into a project in the future. It's really hard to talk about giving spoilers. So maybe, listener, if you don't want, these are very minor spoilers, but if you don't want any spoilers at all for House of Leaves, maybe skip 10 minutes into the future. But the whole thing is written like this elaborate labyrinthine essay almost. And then there's footnotes on an essay. The idea is this guy has found this essay by someone, and now he's delving into the essay himself. So there's footnotes, but then there's footnotes to the footnotes, and then there's footnotes that the guy who's found the essay has left on the footnotes. It gets really labyrinthine and sometimes circles in on itself in really confusing ways, like confusing in a deliberate way. Considering some of the things that the books is about, it wants you to become lost in the madness, and it wants you to be scrabbling around, wondering where in time and space you are. And it achieves that really well. Then some other things it does to that.
That sounds pretty amazing.
It is. So I'm holding up the book right now, and you can see the formatting on the page. Literally, some of the words on this page like make a ring on the page. It's like a ring or an archway in words. I'm actually not up to this part yet, but he uses formatting in the book, like the way the text is structured on the page, to imply certain things and to give suggestions about what's happening. This is literally sideways. You have to turn it sideways, then it forms like a T. I've not seen anyone play with that before. Upside down text, or text where the paragraph forms a shape on the page, or blank space without words being used for emphasis or to make some kind of symbolic point. It's really, really cool. And I really want to try and play with some of this stuff.
It's quite bizarre. It works though, you're saying that all comes together? And
I think so. Yeah,
okay.
I think it does. At the very least, it's intriguing as all hell.
Yeah. Labyrinthine is the word.
Labyrinthine, yes, is definitely the word for multiple reasons. No spoilers.
That's a fairly significant part of it. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting given the long history of human writing that no one I can really think of has really attempted that sort of playing with the form in that way, playing in terms of negative space and text in certain spots and things. But it's really quite unique. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Well, there's got to be other people that have done it, I assume. But I think this is one of the most popular, if not the most popular example.
I don't think it always perfectly serves the story. I think there are parts of it it can get a little gimmicky, but for what it is, it's a really, really cool experiment. Yeah, for sure. But the story itself is great.
It's hard to know how to take this sort of stuff and incorporate it into my current writing, though, which is like a normal narrative story. But I've spoken for a while now. I'll come around to like what I'm reading currently and how my current writing is influencing that later.
How about you, Alex?
Okay. Well, as I've said, I've been playing this game Prey, it's actually a sequel from a previous game that I heard about back when it was like 2006, and I always wanted to play it and I never did. So I tried to find that game, and I found this because it had been released on. Anyway, I found this other game that was. There's a sequel in spirit, although it didn't use any of the same developers or anything like that. Anyway.
This is the one on the ship, is it, with the mimics?
Yeah. It's on a space station, and you've got these little creatures that run around, and they actually take the form of other objects. And it's not so much it was really just the basic premise I wanted to do, but then I wanted to really take up ideas of combining, like these scientists combining organic life with artificial intelligence, and like each like there's two scientists and they both have their own motives for why they want to create this, and really just playing with that sense of like, well, that Mary Shelley sense of like, well, who are we to give life? At what point does that life become sentient and its own sort of creature? So I won't get too far into it, but basically that set up an idea in my head of combining this other thing of like sort of almost like a cruise ship sort of idea. There's a whole lot of ideas I'm bringing in together with it, but basically what I'm saying is that what I am playing and reading right now has very much focused my intent on this specific story, and I can't really not do that now. Like I have another book that I need to finish, and I will get to, but I think I just need to do this for a while, and I'll probably do it for like 3 or 4 months, and then go, okay, I'm going to take a break from that. I'm going to complete the book I'm doing. But that's just how my brain works. It just has to. But yeah, now I have to keep playing this game, and I also have to keep reading stories about that, because otherwise it'll just go, whoa, get over here now. But I don't want to do that, because it's a very, very strong idea, I think, and it fits very much into my sort of horror, spooky mold. Does that make sense?
How what we're reading makes us want to deviate off into side projects that are not what we're currently doing, and maybe not what we should do. Yeah.
But I would like to say, because it's so scientifically based, and this is another way that what I'm reading has influenced me. I've read a lot of Michael Crichton and also John Wyndham, and those guys are these kind of older sci-fi. Well, no, Michael Crichton's from like the 80s and 90s, and then John Wyndham's way from back in the 50s and 60s. But these guys have a really strong focus on actual science, and like, hey, this came from this thing, and it makes the work so much better, because it's like you can see where this has sort of come from. So I really wanted to go like, no, this time I want to do some research. I want to do some proper research and figure out what's going on. So that's why I've delved into the biochemistry stuff, and I've started going through this. I wouldn't say it's dry, but it is very challenging. It's very challenging material. It's literally talking about the Krebs cycle and like molecules taking off from other molecules and things. So yeah, I'm using that and almost trying to get into the mindset of how someone who is very analytically minded in that direction would think, so that then that'll permeate into the writing. Does that make sense?
That's quite cool, yeah. I like that.
There's a whole lot of things that are coming together that I'm trying to squeeze together before I start going, and then I'll just vomit. I'll just vomit up the story, and hopefully that'll work.
I know you haven't been very interested in doing research for books before, so this is a leveling up. This is getting into research mode. Very good.
Not something I've really approached before. I think because I was afraid of like, it sounds stupid because I'm a writer, but like physically having to go through all the reading through manuals and things. But I'm like, if I just listen to it as an audiobook, like I can just do that. It's like found time, So I've realized that's probably my version of research. I just have to listen to a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
I understand not wanting to be. I know that we were talking about how we're writing, what we're reading influences what we're writing, but I often find sometimes if I'm reading something, it'll pull me off in a different direction. I'm changing the way I'm approaching the project or wanting to do another project. So I often try not to read fiction that is too closely related to what I'm writing about, in case it makes me alter it. So I try to read nonfiction that can be applied as like details to what I'm writing about. So if I've set a sort of place, I'll read nonfiction about that place, because it won't make me deviate from what I'm doing. It'll just be like information and details I can add in to make what I'm writing.
I really like the idea of that. I'm writing at the moment. I've got back into writing. First novel I've ever tried. It's called Sovereignty, and it's basically about someone who is very, very enthusiastic about home defense and basically making his house into an impregnable fortress. And I front loaded with that with a lot of research, because I enjoy research. Actually, I really like it. But I hadn't thought about trying to find podcasts and books and articles and stuff while I'm reading.
If you were to consume an awful lot of the kind of information that your main character is consuming, that would only help you get like more inside his head.
Totally. 100%.
You know what I mean? Because you would come across stuff where you were like, oh, that's actually a really good idea.
Yeah.
And then you'd be like, oh, that's the kind of thing that he'd think is a good idea. And then you come across stuff which is a bad idea, and you know that that's a bad idea because you've done that amount of research, and now you know what that character can assess as being shitty type of home defense. You know what I mean?
That grenade's not going to take up anyone's arm.
Exactly. Reading things like subreddits, you get a good sense for the opinions and voices of people in a certain community. Sometimes would scare the hell out of you. But man, there are some very strongly opinionated and frightening people in this space. But yeah, like that kind of research simultaneously to writing, probably a very good idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing you bring up, researching actual communities, because I feel like there'd be a lot of juice in that, in terms of getting the voice of someone. Like if you can see if they think more analytically or more creatively, or
Emotionally,
exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of emotional thinking in this community.
I can believe that for sure.
Yeah.
So, for example, our two projects that we're working on, the voice of those two things, and I mean the narrative voice here, not so much. Oh no, the voice of the characters as well. But I feel like they would be slightly different in that the thing that I'm doing would be more scientifically and I'm trying to think more analytically focused, and what you were doing, the voice might be more emotionally charged because you're talking about the difference between essentially preppers, like doomsday preppers.
There's a lot of crossover.
Yeah, and scientists who are like, oh no, we need to do this and experiment. Yeah. So yeah, I feel like those two voices would diverge in very specific ways.
Probably, yeah. James, what are you writing at the moment or reading at the moment that's influenced you in writing?
Well, I was saying about how humankind have kind of maybe reassess how I was gonna approach certain things, but definitely watching All of Us Are Alive kind of made me reassess some of the stuff I wasn't going to put in, some of the stuff that I thought was a little bit tropey or a little bit overdone, like when one of the members of the party gets bitten or appears to have been bitten. How did the group deal with that? Which they bring up a bunch of times in All of Us Are Dead in very interesting and kind of original ways that I really enjoyed watching how the group dealt with that conflict. And I kind of realized that is almost like the high drama of a zombie story, because it is about the group dynamic. It is about how would you deal with this situation if you were in it? How would you want to deal with it? But if you were with a group of people who had different reasons or different motivations for how to deal with it, how do you negotiate that? How do you choose to do something which keeps the group safe but also maintains the homogeny of the group? Because if you've turned around and just thrown someone out or murdered someone, or if you stand against someone, you could create a conflict within the group, which then affects things later on. So it really made me kind of reassess putting in some of those scenes that I had originally thought I wasn't going to bother with because they're overdone and they're tropey, and it's the same thing, we've all seen it before. And I was like, no, so you have to find a new way of having that same thing. So that kind of conflict management is some of like the high drama of a zombie story. So I kind of reassessed whether or not I put that in. Decided I probably will put it in, but just do something, take a new and original take towards it.
Yeah, it's always really cool when you read a story that it doesn't lean away from the, I'm going to say the cliches, but at least like kind of the archetypes of the genre, and you read it and it's really good. And it's like, oh yeah, you don't need to completely reinvent the wheel. You can just do a really good version of the genre tropes, and it can be great.
I feel like, and I don't know if I'm up to the point in skill where I can kind of do this, but I get the sense that once you get to a certain point, very much like songwriting or any artistic endeavor, when you get to a certain narrative point or a plot point or a trope, you can see where it's meant to go. You can see where, oh, this is naturally where I'd take it, and you can make a very deliberate choice to do this fork like that, which will be super interesting. And I feel like the more you write, the better sense of like, oh, this is one of those times where I can subvert expectations, or maybe not subvert expectations, or pretend to subvert. And like, I feel like these nodes come along where you can be like, oh, someone's okay. Let's see. Say for example, I don't know, the air is being let out of the space station. We all have to go into the airlock there, and that's like, there's a lot of things you can do. They're like pressure points that you can then go, well, okay. The idea would be someone's probably going to die in this bit, but you could always subvert that and have them nearly die, and then be a resource drain for the rest of the story, like something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the sort of thing where the more I think you read of a genre, the more you can get ideas about how you can pivot those plot points out into different directions. Like you can see what's possible in that sort of genre space. So I've been reading the Wolf Hall trilogy. Really, really good. And Hilary Mantel's prose is exceptional. And some of the things she does are really interesting and really subversive to what kind of like what is recommended of writers. So for example, she plays really fast and loose with tense. Like, I mean, like present tense, past tense, future tense. Sometimes, yeah. But the thing is, she does it so deftly that you don't even notice. You're not taken out of the story at all. Like sometimes I have to like go back and say, like, wait a minute, was she writing in present tense or past tense there? And I see that it was past tense when the rest of the chapter has been in future tense. Not because like there's any change in the story, It's just she's naturally changed. But it doesn't matter. This is like, I don't want to give this as advice to people who are listening out there, because like it's typical advice that paying attention to tense is important because you don't want to confuse the reader. But I guess she's at the point where she can break that really freely. And honestly, it doesn't take you out at all. Yeah, and it's got me thinking, like, if you listen to people like talking in the real world, if someone's telling a story and the story happened in the past, they'll often just break into present tense, past tense, and use it fluidly and go back and forth. So why can't you do that on the page? I guess the reason is you could confuse the audience, but I think if you do it deftly...
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of making it easy to follow.
Whenever I get characters to tell a story, they inevitably drop into his present tense. But that's speech, so it's a little different. Like actual verbiage. Like, so they're technically allowed to speak in whatever tense they want. But doing that from a narrative style is, I can see how it would work if you want to really focus in on a certain scene. And like, say for example, if there's a moment of action, it suddenly drops into like present tense. That could be a very powerful way of focusing the narrative over that point.
It's just made me think about how I possibly want to play with that, or how tightly I want to adhere to the idea of like, you absolutely don't change tense. That's a real kind of cardinal sin. Maybe it's not. I don't know. It's something I want to explore.
Yeah, I guess it's something that when you understand where you're doing it well enough, because I'm thinking about, I don't want to kind of draw different, with like martial arts and with like Muay Thai and stuff, an awful lot of like advanced techniques are breaking basic rules.
Yeah.
But what you have to do is you have to learn the basic rule and do that properly in order to know how to then do the advanced technique.
You have to learn the rules before you can break it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably the same with writing, where you need to be able to do it the right way properly in order to understand how to break it in your way and understand what the effect you're trying to have is. And if the effect is simply like, it sounds better in that tense, it's a more interesting way to write about it, and understand that that's what you're doing and that's why you're doing it.
It has to be intentional. I think you have to have an intentionality. You're not just doing it by accident, like, oh, I guess I just broke into present tense here, I forgot. There's a very deliberate choice to do it, at least on a, I don't know, I mean, maybe if you're a prep pantser, at least on a subconscious level. But yeah, there's an intentionality to it. Or like, yes, this is what I'm choosing to do, as opposed to like, oh, I guess this is just what happened because I forgot.
Do either of you guys get influenced by the prose itself of a book that you're reading? Like, do you ever read the prose and see something interesting or beautiful? Like, wow, I really want to.
I absolutely felt that way with, although maybe it wasn't the prose, when I read Blood Meridian.
That's on my list. Yeah. Oh my God. How can you not be influenced by the prose of that?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the prose were really good, but it was the fact that the character had no emotion at all from the character. Like, you were just following this blank slate, which I found really interesting. And as I've said before, I've written a character who was supposed to be slightly psychotic, or potentially sociopathic, or have something asocial, or is that the right word? Something wrong with him anyway.
I don't know.
So I had left an awful lot of the internality out. And I've just been told again and again that you can't do that and you can't relate to the character. So when I read Blood Meridian and I read the whole story, and I was maybe not connected or empathetic with the kid, but I was very interested in him as a character and the things that he was going through, the things that he was seeing, even though there is zilch. He is not present on the page. He is just a body walking through the story. There's a little bit, but which I thought amazing. Like, I was filling all that space up with like, who is this? What is he thinking? What is his vibe? I found it very, very interesting. I'd be very interested in reapproaching the character I had really tried to write, but changing around, because I think that is pulled off by the prose and by the style of writing that Blood Meridian was done in. I don't think it would work in a standard story that was written a normal way. Cormac McCarthy wrote that in a very beautiful, very interesting way. It was very beautiful. You really felt like it was very cinematic at times.
Incredibly cinematic.
Fuck,
the landscape was almost like a character of itself in itself.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
I think it also helps that the kid who's the protagonist is he's really young, and the world is just shaping him completely. Yeah. I mean, he kind of is a blank slate. He's an empty vessel that's being shaped by the world. And I think once you're like, oh my God, like, what must this be doing to his psyche? When you think about that, it almost, not only does it not matter that it's not written on the page, it's almost more powerful, because you fill in the blank space with like, this must really be messing this kid up. Like, he is going to be an absolutely traumatized mess of an adult.
yeah, his internality is what you're seeing and what's all around him and stuff.
Yeah.
You know
Alex,
what I mean?
read Blood Meridian. It's really good.
It's so good, man. It's
Yeah,
absolutely
no,
good.
I intend to for sure. I've got to get through the road first just to make sure I'm like on the level with it. And then
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and it's also about
Um,
like a tenth of the size, which helps.
Yeah. I was going to say Bret Easton Ellis does that a lot in Less Than Zero as well. There's just this the character is there's almost no like emotion directly put forth by him. He's just like
That's not just like the typical science fiction author bad at characters thing.
No,
is it?
no. It's a very deliberate choice to be like to be a little removed from the character. I don't quite know how to explain it. There's just a lot of actions, like a lot of physical actions being done, but zero internality. Like at no point he's like, and it's written from first person as well. At no point is he like, felt bad that Cindy wanted to do this thing. It was just like, Cindy went to smoke a cigarette. I also went to smoke a cigarette. And then she's like, I'm fucking Cole. Oh, I said. Like, it's just straight like that. Towards the end, it does get very, like, the story takes a really dark turn, and the emotions that the characters are feeling are implied, but certainly the main character is always just super zen. So it's a very similar thing. But that comes from the opposite perspective, where this person who's maybe like 18, 20 is like incredibly cynical, like drug taking, like just all these sort of things. So it's almost like there's had this, he's been numbed by all these experiences and now they just don't affect him, which you find out by the end is not totally true, but yeah, it's a very powerful way to write.
That sounds like the best in Blood Meridian. Like you can almost get the impression that it's just the events rolling off him and he's unaffected, but you get glimpses in the book, especially toward the end, that it's messing him up.
Definitely damaged, yeah, 100%. Exactly.
Blood Meridian, right?
Yeah.
Cormac McCarthy pretty much just uses commas and periods. I don't know if he uses any other punctuation marks in the book at all.
No quotation mark for dialogue. I remember that.
Yeah, and no punctuation mark, which some people actually hate, by the way.
Awful lot of Blood Meridian in Spanish, so I had to go and like look up what so much of the dialogue was.
You know, I didn't, because like I never got the. That's another thing. Some of it's in Spanish, and it never bothered me. Like I was kind of like, okay, I think I know what they're talking about. I think I get the gist.
Oh, there's some moments where like you have no idea, because I remember there's like a scene where there's a big bar fight, and the guys ride out of town. And there's one Mexican lad left stabbed, and he gets up and he kind of walks out of the bar.
I can't remember
and
that.
People are speaking to him in Spanish, and then he replies in Spanish, and then the chapter ends. And I was like, what? Google Translate, and I type it in, and what they were saying was like, where are you going? And he replies, I'm going home. And he's been stabbed, and he's just like, I'm just going home. And it was like, is he going home to die, or is he going home? He'd be fine. Yeah. But I had no idea what that could have been. I really wanted to know because I was so curious, because it's said with such emphasis as if you know what he's saying. So it's excellent, absolutely excellent.
There is a sense with his writing, I think, sometimes that like he gets it and he's less concerned if you get it, which isn't great advice in theory, but
get on board. You'll get left behind.
I think personally my prose style has been developed to a point where I don't necessarily take a whole lot of influence from how something is written. It's not to say that that's impossible. The main thing for me is I'll read something in first person, like present tense, and be like, boy, I'd like to be writing that style of thing like now. But then by the time I get to it, like, you know, writing something like that, I'm reading something else, which is in third, you know, omniscient, and I'm like, oh, that was
I consider myself a real like prose guy. So I think because I'm such like a fan of different prose, I can't help but read something and then just sponge it up and be like, I really want to try writing in this style. I really want to try writing with this voice. I love that. I mean, like, yeah, that's the problem with writing one thing and not deviating, is you got so many ideas that you want to try out. But
yeah, I definitely mix up the voices, I suppose. But there's definitely a certain purpleness that I don't tend to venture into, because I don't know, I get scared. I'm just like, I just always remember that there's a quote by Guess Who, and he's like, there's
starts with an S.
And he's like, look, one adjective on the page is like a daisy. It's pretty and it's unique and it's cool, but pretty soon they start popping up all over the place, and it looks like weeds. So I'm always just I'm just look. There's nothing wrong with having a paragraph. Yeah, it is. It is. I hope I didn't butcher it. There's nothing wrong with having a paragraph that is particularly flowery, but I'll for emphasis. But I try to reel that back very, very quickly. Like if something needs to be really like intense, like I'll lean into that there. But
if you read an example of something that's written like I say flowery, that sounds like it's denigrating it, but let's say it's written in a rich and sort of poetic way for like a lot of the book, and
if it's written way the whole way through, yeah, that's a different thing than if you're writing a page or just very flowery stuff, you'd be kind of like, oh, what are you doing? You're kind of going off in this direction.
Unless he does it for effect or some kind of specific purpose.
I just find that prose like that, it can get a bit exhausting reading for too long. Like I haven't read Blood Meridian, so I can't speak to the techniques that he's using, and certainly parts of Moby Dick are very, very. I'm trying to think of a good word for it, like purple.
Rich. Rich is like. I mean,
but yeah,
also sounds like integrating a little bit.
The notion of something being rich is like that's a comparison to food, and if something's very rich, you can't eat a lot of it without feeling full, right? So I feel like you need those moments of sparseness. And from what I hear, Blood Meridian does have some pretty sparse prose sometimes.
Yeah, it very much so. It's either very stark or very...
Sorry, someone who writes very richly, fairly consistently, I'd say, is H.P. Lovecraft. And it's very difficult to maintain that tone the whole way through and take it seriously the whole time, because it's just so like, oh, I was aghast at I cannot pen the depravity of what was experienced by me on that night, and yet I will try. Like it's a bit like okay, buddy. Like
I adore that. that hits right in my spot around that. Yeah. Layer it up. Spend a paragraph talking about how you can't tell me about the thing that you.
Yeah, let me tell you how I cannot tell you about it. Let me try and find the words which I'll not be able to. But he's maybe a good example of someone who leans too far. Or another thing, like I'll have to basically do what I'm doing. I'll have to read through Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, but it is I can't handle it. It's so because it's right in the Romantic period. It is technically Gothic, but it is so let's say rich. I would say flowery. It feels flowery to me. That like I've tried to read it like 3 times, and I just get like a third of the way through. And I'm like, this story is great, but like the language is too much. It's like ugh. Now, look, Frankenstein's a classic, so obviously I'm going to be castigated for that. But for me, it's just like, this is too much. I can't handle it.
The ways in which what you're reading influences what you won't want to write.
Yeah,
that's also influencing your writing, I guess, right? Because it's pushing you away from ever wanting to do something like that.
Or at least wanting to do that in the moment, Like, I remember listening to Dirt, the album by Alice in Chains, and just being like, this is too heavy. I can't deal with it. And going back to it now and being like, this is really messed up, but it's also great. It's not something I'm going to listen to every day. I'm like, this is a deeply, deeply disturbed individual writing these lyrics, and that's cool. Like, it's great music, but not something you can listen to every day.
No,
I literally listen to it every day.
James, I didn't know you listen to music that heavy. That's great.
One of my top 5 favorite.
Really?
Albums.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's fantastic, but it's a lot.
I asked you once if you listen to metal, and you said no. That's totally a metal album.
Yeah, it's grunge.
Metal.
All right, well, it's heavy rock.
Heavy rock, yeah. I'd fall into the heavy rock space for sure. Yeah. Oh yeah. Tool, Nine Inch Nails, Alice in Chains. Can't be beat.
Children of the Nails.
Yeah.
What you were saying, Alex, when I started to read Wolf Hall like about a decade ago, I wasn't ready for it, and I found the language too much. I found it too obtuse. I couldn't get into it at all. And it's interesting when you come back to something like that years later, and suddenly you're really engaged. I think it sort of shows yourself how much you've come as a reader and a writer and an appreciator of literature, how much your taste has changed, and how much you can now consume stuff you couldn't.
I was just saying, I quite like. I wouldn't like to listen to stuff that's very rich. But I like reading stuff that's very rich if I need to stop sometimes and make sense of what it was in my head, which I find sometimes happens, which maybe because I've read a lot of Lovecraft, I've kind of got a knack for knowing where he's going and what he's saying. But definitely when I was reading Meridian, a bunch of times I just had to stop and take a second and read it again and say what exactly was it that was happening.
I think you'd be doing yourself a disservice almost. Like, I mean, sure, audiobooks are blood reading great, but it's one of those books where you want to reread what's on the page and think about 100%. It and stop. I felt like that with Moby Dick. I listened to an audio of Moby Dick, and I think a lot of it, I think it would have been better reading it, even though it's so long, because there's so much there and so much beauty that it's too fleeting if it's audio. It just comes and goes.
You need to let it sink in a little bit. Yeah.
It's good to have that artifact, that physical, like, you know, you can bookmark things, or you can put little tabs and stuff there if there's something you particularly like. I know that's very popular right now. I'm reading it physically, and I've been reading it for years, but I come back to it and I remember where it is, and I'm like, oh yeah, Queequeg, he's doing this right now. That's fun. What I started doing recently is actually keeping a coffee table book there and just like making myself go and pick it up and read through it. One of my students gave me the let me find it. It's right here. The Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. I mentioned this a few podcasts ago. Just had that there, and they're just very short stories, very punchy. You just pick it up every now and flick through it and read another story, because they're only about 2 pages long. And that's a really good way to ingest very small pieces of literature very effectively.
Yeah, definitely. Short stories are probably great for that, actually. Being able to like delve into a certain writing style and a certain like structure style and stuff, get some ideas from it, and then move on to the next thing. A little while ago, I mean, I listen to Dan Carlin's shit whenever I can, because Dan is the man. Dan is the man. Dan Carlin is a history podcaster who, I mean, a lot of you have probably heard of. Did you say here's the thing, Alex?
Yes, I said, here's the thing about Dan.
Here's the thing. Anyway, he was doing this.
I recognize at this period in time.
Yeah, he's a parody of himself. No, I love his stuff so much, and he's doing this thing on the Assyrians, who were a very pretty brutal civilization, near the cradle civilization in the Middle East, like a long time ago. And they were really warlike, and they had this habit of whenever they conquered a people, they would make a massive mural of the conquest, showing like the enslavement of the people and the slaughter, and they would have inscriptions under it with stuff like, their men we butchered, their women we enslaved, their cattle we slaughtered, their earth we salted. It would just go on and on like that. But it's really powerful stuff. Like, it was written to drive home, yeah, don't mess with us, because here's all the ways in which we're going to kick the crap out of you. And I remember,
flex, just like chiseled into rock.
It is. It's flexing into rock. But it's so powerful, even though it was written like thousands of years ago, that I ended up taking that voice and like writing this short story. It was from the perspective of like this conquering tribe using a lot of that language. And I'm still quite proud of it.
Is that
No, I never showed anyone. It's just like something that I've got stuck in a cupboard somewhere.
That's the time period, really?
Around the time of the Babylonians, so 4000 BC. That's I don't know. It was a long time ago. Wow. But it's funny how like the most random of texts, like video games or ancient texts or the Bible, can influence your stuff in really surprising ways.
Yeah, to spark something off. Definitely,
yeah.
It's about that. I think at the end of the day, I think you have to be very careful to cultivate not necessarily what you're reading, period, but what you are reading and when you're reading it. You know, like I know a lot of authors have said, I've just like listened to them or talked to them, and they've just said, if I am writing something, I will only read in that genre for the duration of writing that book, and that makes a lot of sense. Because if you have a more ADHD brain like me, it's very easy to get sucked off into that tangent there. So, be careful what media you are consuming if you want to continue writing in a certain way.
Yeah, you're trying to stay consistent.
Yeah,
need to watch it. Yeah, for sure. I'm the same.
I wonder how much. I mean, I say bad, like it's hard to say what's bad and what's not, but I'm just like, let's say bad prose. I wonder how much bad prose and bad writing influences you as well. Like if you're reading...
I guess if you read, because I read a lot of stuff about zombie stories that is like badly written.
Yeah.
But maybe it was written by like a soldier or something. So what they do really well is they acknowledge the reality of like the supplies that they need to bring and just the mundane everyday aspects of survival, because a writer will go about that very differently. God, I can't remember what the name of the story was, but I know he was just talking about like the zombies were drawn by sound. So obviously a writer is going to talk about the characters moving through a space trying to stay very quiet, then making noise, and this alerting the zombies, and that's your drama, your conflict. Whereas he, as a soldier, was able to say the zombies are drawn by sound. Take a look at the area I'm going to go into, and these are the points where there's noise. So the zombies are going to be in those areas. So I'm going to go where it's quiet, so there won't be any zombies. Then, because there's no other sounds, I'm much louder when I go through that area. And it was a totally different way of approaching that situation, which just felt like if I was writing a story where characters had been surviving in this world for a long time, they would have developed those same skills. So it's little things like that can be very beneficial. But if you make the mistake of saying, wow, that was a great book, and then you focus too much on those areas, and because the writing really fell down on the character and the drama was not strong. So you kind of, you could easily make the mistake and say that was a great book and then copy the writing style. And
well, you cherry pick, don't you? You have to take the items that because no one's going to do everything well. Like I'm trying to think of any writer who I think does everything really well.
Hilary Mantel of the Wolf Hall trilogy.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I'll never stop praising it. It's flawless.
There's just so many different aspects to something that you want. Like you got to have good characterization. You got to have good plotting. You've got to have good use of tropes. You got to have good subversion of tropes. You got to have good technical knowledge. You have to have good pacing. There's so many things, and so many different writers do things very differently that it's important, I think, to read the best of whatever it is, like whether that's a technical manual or that is a like a really well-written thesis or a, historically regarded novel. I think it's important to read at the highest level of those sources and then take the best things from those sources and maybe recognize the worst things of those sources and try and work out how they could have been better. Because you can learn a lot from failure as well, I think.
Definitely. I love to read things or watch things and think about like what I don't like about it and what I would, I may say improve, but what I personally would change. It's hard to know how much of that is just a taste thing. But yeah, I think watching things that are bad or that you don't enjoy can be really, I'm not going to say just as instructive, but I think they can be very instructive.
What would happen to a cake if you took out certain ingredients? Right?
Yes, it is.
You know what I mean? You just leave out one thing and then you say, oh, it falls apart. Okay, so now I know that one thing is necessary to keep the structure of the cake.
But that chocolate sauce, that icing on the top was pretty tasty,
Yeah. Oh, that's it. Like, the icing, like you can still make the cake, but it's not going to taste as nice without the icing. So you want to throw that in.
Yeah. But every now and again, a cake is made without a key ingredient and it still works. And that's really interesting. Like, ooh, that cake didn't have egg and yet it's very good. That book didn't have any semicolons and yet, boy, howdy, Blood Meridian was great.
There you go. Yeah.
There you go.
I don't think it's possible to write a good book without semicolons, frankly. They're the most important part of punctuation.
Absolutely.
I actually lose semicolons, but I love semicolons. People yell at me.
I love a good semicolon.
Definitely my favorite colon.
Yeah, I'm on team semicolon. So speaking of the Wolf Hall trilogy and Hilary Mantel, which I will continue to go on and on and on about, this is a reading from Bring Up the Bodies, which I've just finished. Massively influential on me. And I'm looking forward to reading the third one. So this, the tale is told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, who think of him basically as the equivalent of the Prime Minister to Henry VIII. So Henry VIII is the king, Thomas Cromwell is his main doing guy. And Henry VIII is very temperamental. And it's very important for the people around Henry VIII to understand Henry and what to do around him and what not to do around him and how to kind of guide him toward the right decisions. And no one is better at this than Thomas Cromwell. And he often sort of thinks in his head about not really writing a book called Henry, but kind of he is writing the book called Henry. He's amassing all this knowledge about Henry VIII so that almost one day he could write a book just like this is what Henry VIII is all about. Okay, here we go. Extracts from the book called Henry. As a child, a young man, praised for the sweetness of his nature and his golden looks, Henry grew up believing that all the world was his friend and everybody wanted him to be happy. So any pain, any delay, frustration, or stroke of ill luck seem to him an anomaly, an outrage. Any activity he finds wearying or displeasant, he will try honestly to turn into an amusement. And if he cannot find some thread of pleasure, he will avoid it. This to him seems reasonable and natural. He has counselors employed to fry their brains on his behalf, and if he is put out of temper, it is probably their fault. They shouldn't block him or provoke him. He doesn't want people to say, no, but. He wants people to say, yes, and. He doesn't like men who are pessimistic and skeptical, who will turn down their mouths and cost out his brilliant projects with a scribble in the margin of their papers. So do the sums in your head when no one can see them. Do not expect consistency from him. Henry prides himself on understanding his counselors, their secret opinions and desires, but he is resolved that none of his counselors shall understand him. He is suspicious of any plan that doesn't originate with himself, or seem to. You're better to give way on every possible point until the vital point, and to pose yourself as one in need of guidance and instruction, rather than maintain a fixed position from the start and let him think that you believe you know better than he does. Be sinuous in argument, and allow him escapes. Don't corner him. Don't back him against a wall. Remember that his mood depends on other people. Who has been with him since you were with him last? Remember, he wants more than to be advised of his power. He wants to be told he's right. He is never in error. It is only that other people commit errors on his behalf or deceive him with false information. Henry wants to be told that he is behaving well in the sight of God and man. Cromwell, he says, you know what we should try? Cromwell, would it not reflect well on my honor if I... Cromwell, would it not confound my enemies if I... And all of these are ideas you put to him last week. Never mind. You don't want the credit. You just want action. And that's the end of the reading. Her character portraits are so good. The way she gets the psychology of her characters and works that psychology into everything it's beautiful. And Henry's a giant toddler.
Yeah, that's excellent.
That's a very, very clever way of like delivering all that information about the character, because it is like telling and not showing, but it's doing so in a fantastic way.
I mean, it does so like halfway through the second book, so it's not exactly like she's starting out with this. This is almost like a summary of the things that the reader has learned, just as much as it's Thomas Cromwell thinking to himself. And that's it.
Nice. It's really good. I'm on the first one. I'm still making my way through it.
Okay. Let me know how it goes.
Oh, loving it so far. It's brilliant.
Good.
And Alex, I believe you had a quote for us.
Yes. Okay, so this one's by Oscar Wilde, and it's, what you read when you don't have to determines what you will be when you can't help it.
Deep.
Profound.
Yeah, that's very deep. I like that.
That's a good one.
All right. Well, this has been Pros and Cons. Thank you very much, listeners, for sticking with us. And see you next time.
Adios.
Bye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.